Yes.
There we go. All right. Are we all good? All right. I believe I was at the no justice, no peace part. So we'll just roll it on back.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, like they say in theater, from the top. All right, that's good. All right. We march, we chanted, we declared to a nation unwilling to listen, no justice, no peace, Black Lives Matter. The spirit of social justice pushed us forward through our streets. Suddenly, a line of police, SWAT, and vans blocked our path. They told us if we continued marching, we would be arrested. The organizers calmly asked them to speak to a chief of police or a supervisor to give their demands. The police said no and continued to threaten arrest. The organizers asked again. The police said no again. Therefore, the organizers continued to peacefully march past the arbitrary police line. And at that point, the police tackled, tased, punched, arrested, and dragged them away. To where? The police wouldn't say. The charges? The police wouldn't say. The scene I described was common to see in the summer of 2020. Scenes of police violence against peaceful protesters in the United States filled our screens. However, this did not happen in the US. This protest was in the Greater Toronto area. It was not a protest for George Floyd or Breonna Taylor. Although we honor their lives, we protested the killings of Aziz Chowdhury, Jamal Francis, DeAndre Campbell, and many more community members harmed by police. This protest was not last summer. This protest happened this year. I myself was arrested this year at a memorial march for Regis Korshinsky Paquette, a Black and Indigenous woman who died during a police intervention in Toronto. Regis, Ajiz, Jamal, and DeAndre have not received justice. Instead, the police continue to attack and re-traumatize the community with violence and arrests. The summer of 2020 was a moment of racial reckoning. As important as that moment was to me and Canadian society, it was only that, a moment. The work is not done. Racialized Canadians are still facing discrimination in many sectors of our society. In Toronto, a blatant example is the clearing of encampments in Toronto that are disproportionately Indigenous people. Closer to where you all are, I know the city of Windsor created an anti-racism initiative that was underfunded, disrespected racialized collaborators, and did not include proper consultation with the communities it was supposed to serve. Our governments are not taking anti-racist work seriously. So we must be the change that we want to see. So how do we do this? How can we continue in the struggle and sustain ourselves in this very difficult work? By engaging in anti-racism work as a spiritual practice. Spiritual practice is a term that should be familiar to most UUs. As Unitarians, we have access to books and online resources to help us develop and maintain a spiritual practice. One of the advantages of being the son of a minister are what I like to call shared sermons. My mother, Reverend Pat Trudeau, gave a sermon on spiritual practice last year that addressed the question, how can anti-racism work be an effective spiritual practice? The key elements of spiritual practice she lays out are that they be done with intention and attention. It is important that anti-Black racism work be intentionally specific. In white dialogues on race, the focus on anti-Black racism in Canada is often lost in a broader discussion on diversity and is diverted to talking about the United States. It's important to avoid the urge to divert dialogue to a more comfortable conversation that decenters Black people and alleviates any accountability. I have watched many UUs fumble with this. In a discussion on anti-Black racism in Canada, be intentional in staying on that topic. Unitarians espouse progressive values and principles. I am seeing great strides in UUs being intentional about addressing anti-Black racism in discussions. If there is one thing that UUs are good at, it is certainly talking. However, what is often missing is reliable action that supports Black people. Part of the intention of spiritual practice is that it can be done regularly and be maintained. As much as protests are admired, it is the smaller, everyday, repeatable actions that keep us engaged in the struggle. Activist groups have realized this and have restructured their approach to include multiple forms of resistance. They are focusing on changing policy through contacting officials and supporting progressive politics, educating the public through teach-ins and amplifying the voices of marginalized people, protecting our most vulnerable people through mutual aid, emergency funds, and smaller targeted demonstrations. UUs can learn from these groups. We can strive for an anti-racism spiritual practice that is repeatable and can lead to tangible change. If UUs are intentional in addressing anti-Black racism, committing ourselves to oppose it, developing consistent practices, and holding ourselves accountable to maintain them, we as a faith will be able to adapt and be welcome in this movement for racial justice. Intentional spiritual practice gets UUs in this space physically and mentally to do anti-racism work. But attention is what makes the practice transformative. The outcry after George Floyd's murder forced white Canadians to pay attention to anti-Black racism. White Canadians are now committing themselves to movements like Black Lives Matter. That is good, but y'all need to make sure that you're coming correct. White people start being allies when they recognize that they are the visitors in this movement. Black and Indigenous people, specifically Black and Indigenous queer folk and women, were doing this work long before summer 2020 and will continue to be the vanguard after everyone else goes home. Reverend Aisha Ansano writes, white people tend to be visitors in the struggle for racial justice, ones that aren't forced to be there but can choose to come in and leave whenever they like. People of color reside in the struggle for racial justice by virtue of their race, end quote. White liberals often talk the talk and then talk too much. They give the disclaimer before they speak that they are white and privileged. Their talk appears to show recognition of their visitor status, but the actions show a lack of true attention. I have been in many conversations where white people have commandeered the space to provide some off-topic and self-aggrandizing narrative about how not racist they are. My message is, be mindful of what you are saying and how long you are saying it. As a visitor, it is crucial to listen to the authority of racialized people. Reverend Ansano continues, as people who are constantly in the struggle, people of color have the right to make claims on what they find okay and not okay, what they see as helpful and not helpful. In other words, it is not white people's place to say how we should protest. A compassionate visitor takes accountability for the mistakes and harm they have caused. It is easy to reject external racism, but what about when you are the one being challenged or called in by a racialized person? Will you dismiss it as an understanding? Will you get upset at them for even bringing it up? Or will you listen and accept the feedback, so that you can continue to learn and grow in community. If you truly wish to be allies, you will accept our lived experiences. Trust us. I continue to do this work myself as a visitor in other movements. Since returning to Canada, I have expanded my activism to include supporting Indigenous sovereignty. Even though I am Black, I am also a settler. I am a visitor in their movement. I am sure, or I hope that some of you are familiar with the land back camp in Caledonia called 1492 Land Back Lane. If you're not, quick summary, Haudenosaunee land defenders successfully canceled a housing development project on their land by occupying the site for almost a year. I visited the camp a few times last summer to directly support their struggle. It was on my second visit that I had to confront my visitor status. After the injunction against Land Back Lane was made permanent, a confrontation between land defenders and police was occurring at the camp. Hearing the news, I quickly zipped down to go join the fight. When I got to the camp, it was quiet and dark. I found two people by the fire and I asked them how I could help. They handed me an axe and asked me to chop wood for the fire. They told me the confrontation was happening down the road, so I asked if I would be more helpful there, just hoping that they would say yes. They said no, and that they needed people to watch the camp and tend to the fire for when the land defenders returned. Truthfully, I was a little annoyed. I had driven 2 hours to not to chop wood, but to face off with police. Besides, I'm a city slicker from Toronto and was awful at it. I took a moment and accepted my visitor status and continued chopping wood. As a visitor, I had to trust the Indigenous people's authority. It was not until after that I realized that I was more useful chopping wood than being a non-Indigenous outsider on the front line. Being a visitor also requires consistent self-reflection and humility. As I was standing in this camp, trying to figure out how to chop a log in half, I had to come to terms with my motive to commandeer their movement. I did want to support the land defenders, but I also had selfish motives. I wanted to feel like I was doing something. I wanted to confirm my activism through another confrontation with police. By paying critical attention, I could recognize and reject my problematic inclinations so that I could reduce my harm and be a true ally. By approaching the fight for racial justice as a spiritual practice, grounded in our beliefs and principles, UUs can be a progressive force for change. Black Lives Matter is not a trend. BLM is the continuation of a centuries-long struggle. It is only a trend when organizations adorn the slogan and promise vague diversity initiatives without doing the work. We must ask ourselves, how do we do real anti-racist work that is not dependent on trends, but a genuine, sustained commitment to support Black lives? Here are my recommendations for practices that can be done individually and as a congregation. If you are already doing them, my respect. If you are not, I hope that they will galvanize you. First is to adopt the eighth principle. The proposed eighth principle has been the topic of fervor discussion in these last months. As many of you know, delegates at the CUC AGM voted in favor of it in May, but the vote was eventually nullified due to procedural issues. On November 27th, a special meeting will be held to vote on the eighth principle and commit to other anti-racist actions. This is an important moment in our faith here in Canada. In the 1970s, UU leaders walked away from the Black struggle because they were uncomfortable with Black power. Failing to adopt the eighth principle in November will be repeating that harmful decision. We have the opportunity to begin to address that failure. By adopting the eighth principle, we will make our congregations more attractive to young and racialized Canadians. We can start to get back in step with real anti-racist work outside of the church. We can ensure that our congregations make space for racialized lives over white sensibilities and fears. Although it was formed in the US, consider what recent protests throughout Canada showed us. Racism and white supremacy transcends borders. The results from the Dismantling Racism Study Group's report organized by the CUC supports this. It is clear that the inherent worth and dignity of every person is not specific enough to combat racism in our congregations and in our society. More is needed to include and empower racialized, but particularly Black people. The time is now for congregations to adopt the eighth principle. We cannot let bureaucracy and discussion pacify us. While Black and Indigenous people are fighting for liberation in the streets, while the bodies of Indigenous children are being found in mass graves, the eighth principle is just words, but they are words that ensure that we don't forget that we have an obligation to fight these injustices. The time is now. No, the time was yesterday for us to adopt the eighth principle. A second practice is to donate. Reverend Rebecca Parker wrote in an article, Spiritual Practice for Our Time, that a recommended practice to counter oppressive systems is to donate to just causes. The work of racial justice gives activists energy, but it often does not feed us or put a roof over our heads. My guidelines for donating are: try to donate as local and as grassroots as you can. It is most impactful donating to people organizing and hosting anti-racism actions in your community. Perhaps some members are already connected and know of groups doing anti-racist work in your area. I encourage you to share these groups with the congregation. One note on a lot of the activist groups leading this iteration of the movement is that they do not come with nonprofit status or flashy donation pages. Nonetheless, they are still worthwhile for you to donate to as an individual. Third, educate yourselves and listen. Read Black authors. Read them not to wallow in the tragedy of being Black in North America, but to understand how the racist systems work and what is being done to dismantle them. I suggest the book Policing Black Lives by Robin Maynard. Not a book person? Read the resources and articles on the UUA website written by Black Unitarians. Doing the work on the back end means that when it comes time for work on the front end, you are ready. Right now, racialized communities and activists are calling for the defunding of the police. These once radical ideas have become central in the fight for racial justice. I am also aware that many people are turned off by the idea. Before the summer of 2020, I also questioned the efficacy of the defund the police movement. What changed my mind was learning that the movement was about moving away from a harmful concept of public safety that relies on racialized policing and punishment to investing in community through social programs and services. It is a complex issue, and I understand where the misgivings over defund come from. However, I urge folks to really do their homework on defund the police and the history of policing in Canada. Body cams, sensitivity training, and diverse hiring will not fix a system intentionally built to police racialized and poor people and protect the status quo. Showing Up for Racial Justice, an organization I've worked with in Toronto, is offering a congregational action toolkit to help educate and mobilize faith groups on the issue of police. My final practice is to show out and speak up. Education is good, but the education becomes more meaningful when it is followed by action. If you are able, show physical support. If you are not able to physically show up, there are other ways. Write and call officials. Amplify the experiences of Black people and activists on your social media and to your networks. Advocate for the eighth principle to other Unitarians and congregations. Reflect on how racism exists in your sphere and openly oppose it. As a congregation, you are in a powerful position to write letters of solidarity for activist groups. Seek out groups whose work you support, and as a congregation, send them a letter of solidarity. I was thankful for the support I got from several UU mentors and friends over this last year. I'm learning that spiritual practice helps a person extend beyond themselves. That could mean pushing against the status quo. It could mean accepting the untraditional organizations that are leading the movement. It could also mean adopting new radical tactics to dismantle racism. Whatever it is, it should be uncomfortable, but it should also be liberating. Reverend Rosemary Bray McNabb proclaimed, "Church is the place where we stand with one another. Look the world in the eye, attempt to see clearly, and gather strength to face what we see with courage and, yes, with joy." End quote. Let us develop an anti-racism spiritual practice with courage and joy. I am encouraged by UUs that are acknowledging their racism, are present in the fight for racial justice, and are letting Black UUs like myself lead the way. Be intentional in dismantling racism and pay attention to the movement. Feel the spirit of social justice and let it propel you into action. The spirit of social justice did not end in 2020. The spirit will not be sidetracked by incremental reform or idle governments. The spirit will not be silenced by police and their machines of destruction. The spirit is in the struggle. The spirit is in the movement. The spirit is Black rage. The spirit is live. May it live in us all. Thank you.